Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Dissenter Weekly. I'm Kevin Gostola, managing editor for Shadowproof.com. It's November 5th. And before we get rolling on our whistleblower stories for the week, Brian has a few things for you.
Hey, Kevin. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Before we dive into the stories we have today, I just wanted to remind you, as always, to make sure you're following us on whatever platform you're watching this on right now. If you want to support our work, you can either sign up at dissenter.substack.com and get Kevin's newsletter, or you can go over to shadowproof.com/donate and chip in and help support our work. With that said, let's jump right into our stories for the week here. The first we have landfills may soon have decommissioned nuclear reactors, Watchdog Group warns. Does not sound good, Kevin. What is the story here?
Yeah, and I think we might have garbled the headline just a little bit. It might be better to say nuclear reactor waste, but I suppose it could just be some of the reactors themselves. It's a little confusing on what's going to show up there, but the point here is that this Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, a group that is a watchdog group, they're known for representing people who engage in environmental whistleblowing, but also just good government employees in agencies that are concerned about the environmental policy of the federal government. And they've been particularly vocal under President Donald Trump as I think the number exceeds 100, the kinds of environmental protections or regulatory policies that have been rolled back by Donald Trump. It's staggering. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission under Trump has apparently completed a push, or is very nearly done with their push, to allow commercial nuclear reactors to dump radioactive waste, except spent fuel, in local garbage landfills that were designed for household trash. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission moved to change a longstanding requirement that waste be put in licensed radioactive waste sites that the commission is typically inspected or gone to see if they were abiding by regulations. So the NRC's definition for quote unquote very low level radioactive waste, end quote, that can be disposed is such that it could be that waste will end up in these garbage landfills that contains waste that's the equivalent of more than 900 chest x-rays, because that's the kind of power or radiation that could be in there. So it would be the equivalent of being exposed to more than 900 chest x-rays over a lifetime. It would create, quote, a cancer risk 20 times higher than the Environmental Protection Agency's acceptable risk range, thousands of times the risk goal for Superfund sites, or enough radiation to cause every 500th person exposed to get cancer. That's what PEER warns. And I think this is really important. It's received almost no coverage. So I'll continue with PEER's list of what we could expect as a result of this policy if it is not halted. You would see a transformation of many of the municipal dumps into radioactive repositories with no safeguards for workers, nearby residents, or adjoining water tables. It would allow unlicensed radioactive waste dumps to expose the public to 2.5 times higher levels of radiation than the NRC now allows for licensed low-level radioactive waste sites, which would, they say, create a strong incentive to send all radioactive waste to unlicensed dumps and eliminate the public's ability to find out radioactive waste is being dumped near them. And one thing they do point to is the complete total lack of transparency that this could have, where they would not have to disclose, since it's private information, where a company is dumping this radioactive material. And this is a press release, and typically that's not good practice for a journalist to sit and read from a press release. But I think that there's many compelling details in this. So let's continue, and I'll read the last bit here from the press release that they put out, which says that at present, the U.S. has 104 commercial nuclear power plants, many of which are beginning or will soon start a decommissioning process, removing the need for license sites to handle the staggering amounts of debris from old reactors would be a major cost savings for the industry. This is something that they would really like to do, is their point. And so here's a quote from Peer Pacific Director Jeff Rooch, who says, NRC's deregulation will make it nearly impossible to trace recycled radioactive waste flowing through the stream of American commerce. This plan would plunge the U.S. into the wild west of radioactive waste disposal on a par with a third world nation. So essentially, it would expose a lot of people to really dangerous cancer-causing radioactive waste, and mean that we might not actually know what dumps have radioactive waste or how much radioactive waste are in those dumps. And to the extent that these landfills are leaking, we don't know how much that could end up in the water supply, how much it could end up in land. There's a whole host of problems that are obviously of no importance to the Trump administration as they serve the interests of the nuclear industry. And that has been something that has become a hallmark of this term of Donald Trump, this first term of Donald Trump, that it has been a presidency that does just about everything for fossil fuel companies that is asked. And in this case, we're seeing the great influence of nuclear energy companies and people who are contractors managing nuclear waste, that they're able to get this waste off their hands, that they don't have to deal with it anymore.
Thank you, Kevin. Speaking of Donald Trump, our next story is that it has been revealed that the anonymous author of the Trump administration book is not a whistleblower.
Back on September 5th, 2018, you might recall that the New York Times published an op-ed under the headline, "I am part of the resistance inside the administration." And we were all led to believe that the author was some kind of senior official who was defying directives from Trump and working to oppose his quote-unquote worst inclinations. The author positioned themselves as someone fighting the amorality of Trump and wrote, "This isn't the work of the so-called deep state. It's the work of the steady state." You might remember that. It provoked a lot of mocking because it was somewhat of a ridiculous statement. As it turns out, this person's not a whistleblower. He's a grifter. He revealed himself in the last week to be Miles Taylor, someone who was the former chief of staff to Homeland Security Department Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, and he did this about a week before Election Day. Taylor was involved in defending the administration's anti-immigrant child separation policy, as BuzzFeed reported. Taylor helped Nielsen prepare for public appearances between April and June 2018. He developed talking points under the umbrella of a kind of protecting children narrative. This would help the administration spin what was happening to migrant children in camps, kind of abuse that they were going through. Google ended up hiring Taylor in 2019. There was an uproar among employees because executives they decided to hide his involvement in these anti-immigrant policies. He took a leave from Google in August of this year to support Joe Biden as a part of a Lincoln Project type con operation known as Republican Voters Against Trump. We can see how well that effort did because, as we can tell, these kinds of Republican-backed operations that were raising millions upon millions of dollars seem to have had very little impact on the outcome of the presidential race, since Donald Trump still had record turnout among Republican voters. So I'm not sure what dent they actually succeeded in having in his popularity among their base, among their people. Taylor was hired as a CNN contributor, and he lied to Anderson Cooper about not being the author. And then Chris Cuomo later confronted Taylor, and that was toward the end of October. And what Cuomo said was you lied to us, Miles. You were asked in August here on CNN if you were anonymous, and you said no. Now, why should CNN keep you on the payroll after lying like that? To which Taylor said that that was a good question. And what's important for people to know is that Taylor's a young 30-something Beltway grifter, and what he's doing is not particularly unique to the culture of DC. This is part of a scheme to burnish one's reputation. One might even say launder their reputation through the media. And then it positions himself as a member of the resistance. It allows him to hopefully escape the tarnish of a presidency that's going to go down in the annals of history as one that is truly disgraceful. He was able to author a book anonymously, and he claimed that, as the author, he claimed that the identity would never be revealed. But as it became beneficial to him to come out and say he was the author, he did, and he had worked his way up the ranks of a Silicon Valley tech company. And in political circles, it's very clear he was a kind of fame-seeking and self-important narcissist. And that's exactly the sort of thing that elites usually use to discredit whistleblowers. Many of the cases that I've followed, the people who I defend as truth tellers are often attacked for allegedly having, what they do is they take the behavior and they try to persuade the public into believing that those individuals are fame seekers. And usually there's not a whole lot of evidence. A lot of the people I've followed are very committed to their ideals and are standing for principles. But someone like Miles Taylor, I think, comes along and is treated like a whistleblower. And I think it gives whistleblowers a bad name, because what he's doing is basically building his brand and trying to make his way up the corporate ladder. And he's young, and he wants to be somebody who can have a hefty political career. So in this case, I think what Taylor did is exactly what we hear national security officials say to discredit people who are truly whistleblowers. And I think that it's shameful that there isn't more accountability for what he's doing to make it more difficult for people to basically be treated as honorable whistleblowers. I just don't think that this is the kind of conduct that is very becoming of someone who would claim to be a whistleblower.
I could not agree with you more on that one, Kevin. Thank you for that story. Our next one here, we have Mueller lacked the evidence to prosecute WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. What do you want to talk to us about here?
Yeah, so for the most part, we've known all along that at least I have, it's been my view and my assertion that WikiLeaks, when Julian Assange still was their editor-in-chief, did engage in journalism. It's protected. We know that the Southern District of New York there, if you go to that district, a judge defended their publication of hacked materials. I'm referring to the emails from Clinton campaign chair John Podesta. And it was, under the First Amendment, what was done was completely defensible. And so far as the DNC alleged against Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, there was no evidence put forward to tie what their organization did to any election interference operation that may or may not have existed. And so it was clear to me that they did not deserve the kind of shaming and the kind of defamatory attacks that came out against them, especially from people who were implicated by the emails, because we know why they were angry and they had to be dishonest and, at first create this perception that maybe they were forged or were inauthentic. And then when that fell apart, try to tie them to some kind of Russian operation. What we now have is from BuzzFeed, this is from Jason Leopold, some newly unredacted sections of the Mueller report from Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report that show that prosecutors did not have hard evidence to prove that Assange or Stone, I'm talking about Roger Stone, but I don't really care about him because he's this guy who basically was lying about how much he knew about what WikiLeaks was or was not going to do with the emails. So I'm going to brush Roger Stone aside and pretty much ignore him entirely during this part. So for Assange, there was no evidence that he was actively participating in the alleged hacks. And as far as communications with Guccifer 2.0, there wasn't a whole lot to tie him to anything that could form the basis of a criminal case. So they investigated, they looked into it, and there just was nothing to bring against him. To the extent that people still needed to hear something to exonerate Assange, here it is. There were factual uncertainties as far as the case went. And the fact is, there was no probable cause to go after Assange. And so I think, it doesn't end it for neoliberals. It doesn't end it for Clinton Democrats. I don't think they'll ever see, Julian Assange as anything more than someone who helped the Russians cost Hillary Clinton the election. But for those of us who deal in reality, this is what the investigation that they supported concluded, that there was simply no evidence to go after Julian Assange. And I think that there's a lot of people, not just with this, but outside of it, but we'll just stick with this. There's a lot of people who owe Julian Assange and WikiLeaks an apology for making claims about them that were not provable within the Justice Department.
Thank you, Kevin. Our last story here is also about Assange, a terrible story here. Fearing deportation, a friend of Assange in Belmarsh prison commits suicide. What happened here?
So I'll go to Stella Morris, who is the partner of Julian Assange, and read her tweets that she sent reporting this tragedy that happened. And she had spoken to Julian Assange and found that a friend of his killed himself in the early hours of the morning on November 2nd. And his body was still in the cell on Julian Assange's wing. And Julian was devastated. She wrote, Manuel Santos was gay. He'd lived in the United Kingdom for 20 years. The Home Office served him with a deportation notice to Brazil. And Julian expressed his condolences to Manuel's friends and family. He did this through Stella. And he wanted everyone to know that Manuel was an excellent tenor, so a singer. He helped Julian read letters in Portuguese, and he was a friend. He feared deportation to Brazil because he was gay. And obviously with Jair Bolsonaro being the president and the kind of regime that he has organized and the kind of people that have coalesced around Bolsonaro, there's an extreme threat to someone like Manuel, who did not want to go back and be persecuted as a gay man in Brazil. And so Julian hopes that there will be an investigation into the deportation decision against, according to Stella. Manuel was at high risk. His suicide was foreseeable. And there's another comment here from Stella that conditions in UK prisons under COVID also play a role. Prisoners are separated from their support network, children, parents, partners. They have practically no time out of cell. Many are unconvicted on remand or nonviolent. They don't have any end in sight. Stella describes it as inhuman and mentions that people lose hope. And so this is something that the Guardian looked closer into, and there was an investigation launched, and it hopefully there will be some kind of, I don't know what kind of accountability may or may not come, but to me, the one thing that I take away from this tragedy is the inescapable thought, which is what I had when I was covering Julian Assange's extradition trial. It's the inescapable thought that perhaps the system in the UK, which I don't want to sugarcoat and make it seem like it's always been rosy for anyone who got incarcerated there, but it just seemed like they had the pretense of caring for human rights a bit more because the country has a human rights charter. And to some degree, I feel like it's falling away, because what I recall from the Assange extradition trial was the testimony of a doctor who was brought to provide testimony as a prosecution witness. And he talked about how, Julian Assange is somebody who's proven to be a resilient man. He's a very resourceful man. And that was his way of downplaying the risk of Julian being put in solitary confinement if he was brought to the United States. And the fact that a doctor who consults on and talks to people and assesses people who are in detention or in incarceration in the UK, and this is the way he would come at the whole issue of keeping people in isolation, is kind of it was so alarming. I mean, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture is someone that I think would have pretty good credibility, because the United Nations, I think, I don't know, maybe it's changed, but politically, I would think people who are British care a lot more about what European people and global voices like that have to say about the threat of solitary confinement. And you hear in the U.S., the politicians from Republicans and the Democratic parties tend to downplay the significance of any pronouncements from UN officials, but it seems to have had currency before historically. And yet you had a person who was testifying against Julian Assange, in a way that would make it possibly give the judge an excuse to allow an extradition request. And he's downplaying the threat of solitary confinement to Julian. So I worry, I'm concerned that within the institutions, the penitentiaries, these detention facilities in the UK, that they've degraded, that people do not care as much about lives anymore as they maybe used to do 5 or 10 years ago. But I have to caution and put out a disclaimer that I'm not from the UK. I wouldn't go too far in my analysis. There's probably more to do. But, it'd be my sense that a lot of groups are having to work harder and harder to challenge these issues, because things are relaxing as far as the kind of corruption that is permitted in these institutions.
Thanks, Kevin. Any final words? Do you want to tell people about the newsletter and anything you got coming up in the next couple weeks?
Yeah. So obviously I just did the whole show, and I don't know if I can conclude it without acknowledging that everyone's got their eyeballs glued to television screens, trying to see if any votes are going to be, posted that will provide some closure to this election. And if former Vice President Joe Biden becomes president of the United States and Donald Trump is no longer president, it will change the state of play to some degree. And I expect to assess that and put together some coverage of how the Assange legal team plans to approach the change in administration. That's something you can look forward to coming from me. I've just been being patient and holding back because we want to officially see it declared that Trump has lost before I write anything or put anything together. And then you want to assess what kind of effect a potential Biden administration might have on whistleblowers and leaks going forward, and look at his record. And that's certainly the kind of writing that I want to do with the Dissenter newsletter, and see how much of the Obama legacy could be expected to come into a Biden administration. Like what kinds of continuity are we going to see from a Biden administration if everything pans out and he wins these razor thin races in these states. So that's something you can look forward to, along with all these other stories I like to keep doing on people who are blowing the whistle on the lack of COVID-19 safety in their workplaces, and also to cover, and to cover whistleblowers as they surface, in the United States, and then occasionally those international stories that are of significance, and to follow any updates on WikiLeaks. Because, of course, we have the ruling, the decision that will be announced on January 4th from Judge Vanessa Baretzer on whether the extradition request is approved to the United States or not. And with that, I'll just encourage you to go to dissenter.substack.com at the banner down at the bottom of the screen. And thank you all for watching this week. Hopefully it provided a kind of distraction from the election and the lack of closure in it, and the frustrations and the anxieties we're all feeling from it being just so despicably close in a country where I think people around the world are looking and are like, how could so many people still want to elect Donald Trump president? And then how could Joe Biden not thump Donald Trump? But without veering into that conversation, I had that on another there's another clip on our channel if you want to see a conversation with Branko Marcetic, who is a Jacobin writer. I talked with him about some of these issues. So if that's a topic you're interested in, I do encourage you to go see that content from our Shadowproof YouTube channel. It is posted. And then, just generally speaking, I'll plug a couple. I'll plug a story that got buried in this last week because of election coverage and everyone following these results. We did a story from Steve Yoder on sex offender registry sweeps and the way in which essentially these are conducted, and they're targeting individuals who do not have homes and have not updated their addresses. And these are cops who are trying to build support for Blue Lives Matter or just policing in general, and they're using these people who are on sex offense registries as easy targets to build up the reputation of these local police departments, and in the process of going after and getting these individuals spreading and contributing in a negative way to the pandemic. So I encourage you to go read that. It's the first piece we published from Steve, and he did excellent work, and I think we'll probably do some more to push that around, especially after we have closure and we know exactly who is the winner. I think this is something we want to share again, just to make sure we get some more eyeballs on it and people can appreciate the work that Steve put into doing this report. Beyond that, I don't have much more to say other than to thank you for watching the show, and to thank you for your continued support of my work as well as the general work of Shadowproof and its freelance contributors.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. And as I said at the beginning of the show, if you weren't with us, please make sure that you're following us wherever you are watching right now. Like Kevin said, we've got a lot of great YouTube videos, not just from this show, but going back to other interviews that Kevin has done with writers and thinkers on a variety of different subjects. So check out our channel. We'll have more of that coming. We'll have more great freelance work coming up in the next week that we've been holding back so that it doesn't get lost in the election cycle. And shout out to Owen Higgins, who also published a great story on the eve of the election about the impact of COVID on postal workers who are delivering mail-in ballots in swing states. So lots to check out. Please take a look. And if you like it and you have a couple dollars, you can swing our way, support our work, support Kevin's work with the show. Head over to shadowproof.com/donate or dissenter.substack.com right there to get Kevin's newsletter. With that, maybe the next time we talk, we'll know who the president will be next year. Maybe we won't. I guess we'll see. That'll be the cliffhanger for this episode. And everybody have a great weekend. We will talk to you soon.